وشفيعنا ومولانا محمد صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم رسوله النبي الأمين المكين الحنين الكريم الرؤوف الرحيم. أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قال الله تعالى في شأن حبيبه إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد كما تحب وترضى بأن تصلي عليه. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وما لكم لا تقاتلون في سبيل الله والمستضعفين من الرجال والنساء والولدان الذين يقولون ربنا أخرجنا من هذه القرية الظالم أهلها واجعل لنا من لدنك وليا واجعل لنا من لدنك نصيرا. صدق الله العظيم وبلغنا رسوله النبي الكريم ونحن على ذلك من الشاهدين والشاكرين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Most respected ulama, my respected elders, brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. In Surah An-Nisa, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala urges the believers in particular to stand up against any type of oppression and injustice, even to a point of engaging or being involved in military exercises and engaging in warfare to protect the needs and to protect the dignity and the honor of particularly the poorest of the poor and the weakest of the weak in the community and in the world. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this ayah speaks about two justifiable and moral and ethical wars or warfare. One is in the part of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for i'la'u kalimatillah, right? To raise the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to raise the flag of Islam and for the protection and the dignity of Islam, Quran and Holy Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. And the second one is a moral and ethical war which is waged against oppressive regimes and tyrants, particularly to protect those who are oppressed from amongst the women and children and people who are in a helpless condition because they have been invaded by oppressive conquering forces. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَمَا لَكُمْ لَا تُقَاتِلُونَ. And Allah said, what has happened to you? Here Allah is urging you again. What has happened to you? وَمَا لَكُمْ لَا تُقَاتِلُونَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. That you do not fight in the way of Allah, which is the first moral, ethical, justifiable reason for warfare. فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. And what has happened to you that you do not fight in the way of Allah and for the oppressed amongst the men, women and children? Why do you not fight for the oppressed men, women and children who say, رَبَّنَا أَخْرِجْنَا مِنْ هَذِهِ الْقَرْيَةِ الظَّالِمِ أَهْلُهَا. Whose dua is, our Lord, take us out from this town whose people are cruel and make for us a supporter from your own. وَجَعَلْ لَنَا مِن لَدُنْكَ وَلِيًّا. And make for us a supporter. Send us an ally. Send one who will support us in our campaign and make us a helper from your own. وَجَعَلْ لَنَا مِن لَدُنْكَ نَصِيرًا. So you will have an ally who will stand with the oppressed people against the oppressor, and you will also have those people who will be engaging in humanitarian aid. وَجَعَلْ لَنَا مِن لَدُنْكَ نَصِيرًا. So in terms of engaging in ethical and moral warfare, right, you have to have those people who are allied to fight against the oppressor and the aggressor, and you also have to have a humanitarian dimension to it, which will help people in terms of difficulties, whether it's shortages of food, whether it is medical supplies, whether it is financial help, whether it is granting refuge to refugees, or whatever the situation may be. And here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has outlined some of the fundamentals in terms of why and how we should be engaging in moral and ethical warfare. Now, one of the most famous books or famous treatises regarding what is known as the art of war was by Sun Tzu, known as the art of war. Sun Tzu means master of the sun. Right? He was a Chinese military strategist, and he's written a treatise called the art of war. But I don't want to discuss Sun Tzu's art of war. I want to discuss what I truly believe from an Islamic perspective is truly the art of war. Right? If you read Sun Tzu's Art of War, you will see that he shows you strategy, he shows you deception, he shows you how to, how to deal with the enemy, how to outwit the enemy, right? How to outrun the enemy, how to outsmart the enemy, etc., etc., etc. Very interesting reading. Right? He shows you when to be strong, when to be weak. So I'll just quote you one day. He says, when you are in a position of strength, right, behave as if you are weak. And when you're in a position of weakness, present yourself as very strong. That's one strategy of war. But look at Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala, Khalifatul Mu'mineen, right? The vicegerent of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Look at Abu Bakr as-Siddiq's art of war. And he gave 10 directives regarding the art of war. Right? He didn't speak about how to outsmart the enemy, how to outwit the enemy, how to destroy the enemy, what strategy you should be employing, etc., etc. The reconnaissance missions and this and that. This is what he said. And he wrote this letter to the armies that were dispatched to Syria in Sham. And he said, فَقَالَ إِنِّي مُوسِيكَ بِعَشْرٍ. He said, I'm giving you advice regarding, these are my words now, the art of war with 10 fundamental requirements. Number 1, لَا تَقْتُلَنَّ إِمْرَأَةً وَلَا صَبِيًّا وَلَا كَبِيرًا حَرِيمًا. He said, do not kill a woman, nor a child, nor an infirm elder. See how he starts off. He's not talking about who to kill. He's telling you who not to kill. Or do not even harm them, even of kill. Don't even cause harm to them. And who did he start from? Do not kill a woman, nor a child, nor an infirm elder. Right? وَلَا تَقْطَعَنَّ شَجَرًا مُثْمِرًا. And then he went on from this weakest of the weak, so to speak, in war-torn countries and in a war situation, the women, the children, and the infirm elders. And then he went on to the fauna and the flora. He spoke about the environment around you. And then he said, وَلَا تَقْطَعَنَّ شَجَرًا مُثْمِرًا. And he said, and do not cut down fruit-bearing trees. Don't create a situation in a country wherein that which is the source or part of the food, or the bread basket, so to speak, and a food source. Don't destroy that fauna and that flora, which is critical for basic survival. Then he went on to say, he said, وَلَا تُخَرِّبَنَّ عَامِرًا. He said, and not tear down inhabited buildings. Now he's talking about urban populated areas. And he's talking about architecture. He's talking about homes. He's talking about buildings, infrastructure. Do not bring down inhabited buildings. Now I want you to keep in mind, as I'm talking, right, how today modern warfare is engaged, right? And how people target the very things first that Abu Bakr as-Siddiq prohibited from targeting. So they'll start off with destroying your power supply, your power system, your electricity grid. They'll start off by destroying hospitals. They'll start off by destroying critical infrastructure. That's what they will do. And Abu Bakr as-Siddiq at this time, he said, you don't destroy them. He said, وَلَا تُخَرِّبَنَّ عَامِرًا وَلَا تَعْقِرَنَّ شَاةً وَلَا بَعِيرًا إِلَّا لِمَأْكَلَةٍ. He said, and do not slaughter sheep or camels except for food. Meaning, you don't even harm livestock. So the food system of the country must not be in any way affected except until or unless you require some food ration. Okay? And then he said, وَلَا تُغَرِّقَنَّهُ وَلَا تَحْرِقَنَّ نَحْلًا وَلَا تُغَرِّقَنَّهُ وَلَا تَغْلُلْ وَلَا تَجْبُنْ. He said, do not steal from the spoils, number one, which means that if there's stock, if there's people's wealth, right, and there's stuff that is lying around that you have access to because they have been vanquished, you don't take it away. It's not your property. You can't steal unlawfully and take away unlawfully other people's property. Yes, it is part of the spoils of war and the booty of war. It's now the government's responsibility as to how to dispense with that. So all the natural wealth of the countries, the mineral wealth, right, the financial institutions and everything that represents wealth cannot be taken away by the vanquishing army. It is the responsibility of the conquering country and its government. And then he said from the spoils, he said, وَلَا تَغْلُلْ وَلَا تَبْجُلْ. He said, and do not act cowardly. Do not act cowardly. Do not do things inside there which will be seen as an act of cowardice, wherein we will apply our power unnecessarily. Or for that matter, we'll deal in a manner where we will be more interested in saving our lives and protecting our interests as opposed to protecting the interests of the general people. Okay? These are the 10 directives in terms of what I truly call the art of war. Wallahi, if you have to engage in such moral and ethical behavior in terms of war, people would welcome a conquering nation like that. They say, might be better than our oppressive government. Now, coming back to what has been on everybody's lips for the past 2 or 3 weeks, right, is Ukraine. And of course, our man, Mr. Vladimir Putin's punitive measures. That's not a Freudian slip. His punitive measures. What does that have to do with Islam? What does that have to do with Muslims? Not much really. The reality of the matter is, the Holy Quran has stated and has spoken about that. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, one is you fight, right, for the sake of Allah, you fight for a just moral cause, or you fight for Taghut. And Quran encapsulates everything that Russia is engaged in right now in that one term, Taghut. Because the kuffar, generally the disbelievers, when they engage in warfare, they're engaging inside there to conquer another country because they have economic interests. They have strategic military interests. They want to usurp all of the natural resources of the land. Right? They want to gain and acquire what wealth is to be found in that country in terms of the technology, in terms of the science, in terms of the doctors, in terms of its geopolitical strategic location, etc., for their own benefit. So when the kuffar engage in war, it is primarily for their self-benefit and for self-enrichment, or to protect themselves from anyone invading them, whatever the situation may be. This is fundamentally what the war in Ukraine is all about. They can couch it in any way possible there, and you know what? You can look at it from any way, whether you look at it from the Western media and so on, right? Or whether you look at it from the perspective of Russia. The reality of the matter is the hypocrisy and the bigotry and the double standards that is being manifest from both camps, whether it is Russia on one side, regarded still, I don't know whether it's regarded as superpower or not, or America, is laughable. Right? Because America did precisely the very same thing when America realized that having a military base, and you call the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s, having a military base in Cuba was too close to home, and the superpower called Russia at that time could attack them from so close by, is precisely what Russia is doing a couple of years later, or 40 or 50 years later, in the sense that they realized that if Ukraine, right, becomes part of the NATO alliance, right, the NATO organizations can use Ukraine as a base to attack Russia from anywhere at any given time. So this is all it is. It's just war games. It's just posturing. And what you get, in the fix or in the mix is a whole lot of gas and a whole lot of wheat and grain and this and that and whatever the situation may be. That's in a nutshell. It's not going to go anything beyond that. Trust me. Right? The war in Iraq, same story. What happened eventually? They got all the oil. What happened eventually? They got 6 trillion cubic meters of gas. Mashallah, they got what they want. At whose cost? At what cost? At the cost of the complete destruction of Iraq, the Iraqi people, their culture, their history, loss of lives, and so on and so on. Nothing for these people. It's just war games for them. It's just gaining more, literally market share, so to speak. But look at the hypocrisy, and look at the bigotry once again. Right, I'm going to read something for you. So, someone sent me a video the other day. I was quite surprised. I had a good laugh about it actually. And this article was in Al Jazeera, right? And he speaks about what is so shocking, that the white Caucasians and the white people of Europe are flabbergasted. They are in a state of shock that how can something like this happen between civilized white people? How can a white person, how is it civilized white person attack a fellow white person? I'll quote to you as this man said, right? The words are, they seem so like us. That is what is so shocking. War is no longer something visited upon impoverished and remote populations. Look at how these white Europeans think, or the white Americans think. Right? It can happen to anyone, wrote Daniel Hannan in the UK's Telegraph. Listen to this one. We are in the 21st century. We are in a European city, Kiev, and we have cruise missiles fired as if we were in Iraq or Afghanistan. Allahu Akbar. We are shocked. This should only happen in third world backward Muslim countries who deserve to be bombed from here to, Kandahar. Right? Because they are third world countries. We are European, white, civilized people. Look at us, look at the color of our skin, right? Can you imagine? This is what a French TV operator said. Reporting from the Ukrainian capital, and I saw this one here. Charlie D'Agata, a correspondent with CBS News in the US declared, listen to the bigotry. You know what's bigotry? Extreme prejudice and extreme fundamental beliefs, which are negative ones, against a group or a people held by a person. And, right? He said, he declared, Ukraine isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan. There has been that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words very carefully, to city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that is going to happen. You know, I read some other articles. Man, if I could spin this thing in an article, I would tell you, wow, look at this. British white people are calling for jihad, guerrilla warfare against the aggressor in Russia. They're actually talking about how to make Molotov cocktails. And I think one of the satirists had written an article also in one of these articles, and he said, wow, maybe you should ask the Palestinians how to do the Molotov cocktail, considering they've got so much experience in it. You want to know how to fight with the Russian invader? Why don't you ask the Afghans? Get them to come inside there. Literally, things that would have been regarded as fundamentalist, right, and inciting to terror, to acts of terror and terrorism, were being flouted in media to say, this is what we need to do for the Ukrainian people. And what was it all about? You know, this whole idea that white Europeans have, and I'm excluding the Americas into it, the white European have, you know, this white European exceptionalism. This shouldn't happen to us. We are the civilized people. We are the educated people. These are the hordes. Those in Africa, those in Afghanistan, those in Iraq, those people who are black in color in terms of their skin, those who call themselves Muslim. These are the people that are uncivilized, who engage in wars and so on. We civilized people don't engage in these activities. That was the degree of bigotry which we've seen now, and never ever, right, ever believe that these people have the interests of anybody at heart, regardless of how much they may tout that from a humanitarian perspective. They only have their own personal interest as a people, as a culture, as an ideology, as an economy, right? And as a political entity. They only have their interests at heart. Now, I want to get to a second aspect, which is a very important one. What about Ukraine? What about the Muslims? And what does it have to do with Islam? Well, let's go to look at the history of Ukraine. The crime that is taking place in an area of Ukraine called Crimea is scary. Up until this morning, Apple Maps couldn't figure out, or finally decided, let's put it that way, Apple Maps finally updated his Apple Map and finally decided that Crimea is part of Ukraine. Really, read it this morning, it was this morning, 7 hours ago. Apple Maps updated and they said, no, Crimea is part of Ukraine. What happened? Let me give you some of the history. In 2014, correctly, I'm not saying justifiably, I'm saying correctly, I'm giving you the information. In 2014, Russia illegally occupied Crimea, which when the USSR had broken up, Crimea was an independent state which would either have an option to become part of Crimea, or the members of Crimea itself would establish their own little, independent states within themselves. Okay? Now what is interesting for us and important for us as Muslims is that in terms of Ukraine, Muslims only constitute plus minus 1% of the Ukrainian population, up to a maximum of a million people. But the concentration of Muslims is in Crimea. Right? And the Muslims that are there in Crimea are called the Tatars. Right? They are called the Tatars. Right? Many of us haven't heard of them. But the Crimean Tatars entered into Islam in the 13th century, around the 13th century. They became Muslim after Genghis Khan's grandson, Batu Khan, took over, and because they had come after the sacking of Baghdad, right? They took over parts of Asia as well, and one of it was the Caucasus. And Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, who was the warlord who sacked Baghdad, right, and destroyed the Muslim capital of the world at that time, right? He eventually became Muslim. Batu Khan eventually became Muslim. And this area, which is now known as Crimea, where the Tatars are, also because of their conqueror entered into Islam. Now, what is very interesting is that if you want to know how long Islam has been in Crimea and how long the Tatari Muslims have been there, well, it was there since, around 1492 or so, right? They are there, they are a Sunni Muslim ethnic group, number one. And number two, they descended from the Kipchak branch of the Turkish language family, meaning they are a close relative of the Tatar dialect spoken in Russia. So they have their origin in the Russian people, as well as the Turkish that is spoken in Turkey. So it's a mixture of the Tatari language of the Russians and the Turkic language of the people of Turkey. Now, Islam was established as early as 1314 because the Uzbek Khan Mosque. The Uzbek Khan Mosque in Crimea is the oldest mosque in Crimea, and it was built in 1314. So they're there for almost what, 700, 800 years? Tatar Muslims. But what is sad was that after Russia illegally occupied Crimea, right, in 2014, there was an article which came out and a report which was presented by the United Nations Human Rights Watch Group. And the Human Rights Watch Group observed that and the Human Rights Watch report observed from 1991 has been observing the treatment of the ethnic people of Ukraine or Crimea, who are fundamentally Muslim. Right? And you're looking at plus minus 250,000, or in fact that's the official figure, but in fact it is more than that. And they have been stating from 1991, there have been war crimes committed against this minority cultural ethnic group called the Tatars, whose religion is Islam. So while all of us stood up and only heard about Ukraine 2 weeks ago, right, Human Rights Watch had already spoken about the atrocities perpetrated against particularly this ethnic group called the Tatars, who are essentially Muslim, from 2017, to a point wherein Russian soldiers and the Russian, the Russian intelligence and whatever it is, they would go out and aggressively engage in locking up people, interrogating Muslims who stood out and spoke out against Russia, especially the Tatari Muslims. Right? The Muslims of Ukraine from 1991, after the basic, the freedom was granted to them, they established themselves, in terms of deen and religion, whether it is the halal authorities, whether it is establishing, their position in what we would call Tatari society or Crimean society, or Ukrainian society, from that time, to show that they are part and parcel of this region and part and parcel of this area, and they have their religion, which is Islam, but they have maintained their history, their culture, and their traditions, which is in the true sense of what Islam is all about. Interestingly, when Batu Khan may have conquered, what we know today as Ukraine, but it has a long history with Islam as well, because one of the wives, or one of the consorts rather, of Suleiman the Magnificent, who was the Ottoman Empire, one wife of his was called Roxolana, right? And the old Latin name for Ukraine was Roxolonia. She was from Ukraine, right? Obviously she was a Tatari Muslim, and she became Malika, and she was known as the king's favorite. And although she wasn't technically the queen, so to speak, because the harem and so on there, she was a consort, and she literally, revolutionized the entire harem and the entire Ottoman Empire in terms of the choice of an heir, etc., whatever it is. But the point is, the Tatari Muslims have been part and parcel of the Ummah since the 1300s. Interestingly as well, is that these Muslims who have been there have been suffering oppression like the Uyghur brothers in China, which is just around the corner, right? And the whole idea was, and the Russian politicians from 2014, when they illegally occupied Crimea, made no bones about the fact that they wanted to ethnically cleanse Crimea of all of this Turkic people. They don't refer to them as Tatars, as ethnically cleanse Crimea of all the Turkic people and from Turkification. Which means that if you are a Tatar, you cannot maintain your cultural identity, nor can you maintain your religious or your Islamic identity. And they made no bones about it, that they wanted to ethnically cleanse, like their Russian neighbors, the Uyghurs, these people, the Russians, wanted to ethnically cleanse the Tatari Muslims. Currently, the president of Ukraine is a Jewish president, and the army comprises the Christians or the Ukrainian people, as well as Muslims. And I went through some of the history of the Ukrainian people. They have a remarkable history. We don't know much about them because they, like the Prophet of Allah said, and he said in the last days, that you will come to a group of people out there whose languages you will not even understand. And these are one minority, and ethnic doesn't mean that you can't understand the language. It means it will be there'll be such a small group of people that people who have never heard of these people, their culture, their ethnicities, and the mashup of their languages, and it will be alien to all of us. Now, can you imagine almost 250,000 Muslims in Crimea alone, right? And the rest of Ukraine has over 1 million Muslims. So imagine our South Africa, where we Muslims live, right? We Muslims are plus minus 1 million Muslims. Imagine if you were under siege. That's a large number. And we are relatively organized, and like we have all our politics and our sectarianism and our ideological issues and our typical. Ukraine has the same thing. Ukraine has the same thing. What the outcome will be, like I said, is all about war games. There's nothing more to it. Interestingly, the history doesn't stop there. There is one claim that one of the oldest written copies of the Holy Quran, right, belongs to the Tatari people from the era of Genghis Khan or Batu Khan. And they have a copy of it available. And this was also unveiled in Jeddah a few months ago or a few weeks ago, when one of the oldest copies or handwritten copies of the Quran can be found and is in the possession of the Tatari people, not only of Crimea, but the rest of Russia as well. So there's a great deal of history okay, we spoke about Ukraine, which is against Russia. Russia, as you and I know it right now, and if you look at all of those former republics of the United USSR, like Uzbekistan, etc., you come to realize that the history of Islam in that entire Caucasus region is undervalued and underappreciated. Undervalued and underappreciated. We speak about Islam when we localize it in terms of region, Middle Eastern Islam, right? Or Indo-Pak subcontinent Islam, or for that matter, African Islam. But we never speak about what we would call Islam of the Caucasus region. Interesting for your information. The most famous one, of course, is who? Imam Bukhari. Greatest book of hadith, according to Sunni scholars, is Imam Bukhari. Where is he? Well, former Russia. Right? And like that, the great scholars are to be found. In Samarkand, in Bukhara, and so on. Some people have been on a tour. I was hoping to go, but COVID hit, but that's not a solid together. If anybody wants to go this time, I'll give it to you. Right? Brilliant history of Russia. The architecture, the culture, and how all of that was imported. The rukus, just for your information. The rukus that you have in your Qur'ans. This is the way the ruku stops. Do you know who devised that system in order to make it as easy as possible to facilitate Salatul Taraweeh so that you can complete the Quran by the 27th night, which is generally regarded as possibly the night of Qadr? The Russian scholars, what is now known today as Russia. So, as far as our Muslim brothers are concerned in Ukraine, it's a humanitarian crisis, right? Which of course have been magnified by the fact that these people are white people, right, by the kuffar. But if it becomes a humanitarian crisis, obviously Muslims, in terms of their humanity, as well as in terms of support of our Muslim brothers and sisters inside there, will help. But the reality of the matter is that when it comes to the whole Ukraine issue, bottom line here is, it's just posturing, it's just war games, right? Don't get caught up in that, in the hype of Western media, right? Very quickly, sanctions were things. I know some people said our means inside, very good man, mashallah. Right? The very same people who will remain silent against the illegal occupation of apartheid Israel, right, of the Palestinian region, are the very same people who are talking about the illegal invasion of Russia of Ukraine. What hypocrisy! What hypocrisy! So read this thing very carefully. They've taken off Russia today. I don't know whether it will be back tomorrow, but it's not a multi-choice right now. Wow! Wow! Look at the solidarity of the white people. Really, we need to see this bigotry for what it is. We need to understand it. Right? And you mustn't get swept away, because the reality of the matter is, while this is taking place in Ukraine, there are so many atrocities being perpetrated. Everybody's forgotten about the hijab ban. Everybody has forgotten about the atrocities perpetrated in Yemen. When last you heard about Yemen? When last you heard about Syria? When last you heard about what's going on in Jerusalem currently? Why? As long as they take away the attention from there, they can continue in other parts of the world, and you and I will get involved in Ukraine. Allah grant us to be